go.
So welcome to the Voices of Faith in Leadership, provided by the Wyoming Interfaith Network. We're going to have a presentation about Buddhism from Dr. Ron Frost, and I hope he tells us a little bit of his story. We have our crew here in Laramie, as well as a few of us are joining from Zoom land, as I call it. And Dr. Frost, would you like us to give you questions as you go or save them for the end?
Oh, I would say it's best to ask them as we go.
Ask them as we go. All right. So
If you ask them at the end, then the context gets lost.
all right. I'm going to turn it over to you then.
Okay, well, I guess I've been a Buddhist since '83. That makes it almost 29 years. And I have had the opportunity to attend the 3-year retreat, which is an ultimate training in Tibetan Buddhism. And after getting out, I got grabbed by the Wyoming Interfaith Network as they needed a Buddhist. So they're talking Buddhist on the interfaith and the wind. Okay, so I'm ashamed to say that I don't think I could give nearly as dynamic a talk as the last speaker, but I'll do my best. And so one of the key things about Buddhism, which I'm going to make a point of regularly, is that it's a practice of self-realization. It involves no, what should I say, no God. It's a non-theistic religion in that respect. Not that it doesn't recognize a spiritual aspect to reality, but it doesn't give it a personality, as do many other religions. So it was founded by Gautama Shakyamuni, apparently around 500 BC. They don't really know when he lived. It could have been 100 years earlier. It could have been 100 years later. And the historical evidence is scant, so that most of what we know about his life is legend. The legend has it he was born as the son of a ruler in a minor kingdom in what is now Nepal. So his father was a king of Shaka. It is said that at the time of his birth, oracles predicted he'd either be a great king or a great religious teacher, so his father made great effort to make sure that he had nothing to do with religion. A great king. So he raised Gautama in the palace, didn't have many access to the outside, gave him all sorts of pleasures, everything he needed, so that he wouldn't know the reality of what's going on in their life. And one time in the late teens, he actually got out of town, out of the palace, went visited the town and saw sick people and dying people. He saw a funeral for someone who had died and realized that life was not as, what should I say, pleasant as was presented by his father. So he came to understand that there are a lot of negative things in life, and he decided to take up the life as a wandering ascetic. Now, the interesting thing about this, if you read a lot of Indian literature about teachers, almost all of them start off as princes and abandon all their stuff, and then they go and become an ascetic. So how much of this is real? We don't know. It doesn't matter really, because the teachings are the important thing, not the data of how it happened. So after years of practice, he finally realized enlightenment.
How do you know when you reach that?
I'll tell you when I do. I think that enlightenment is the ability to perceive things beyond concepts, without concept. I mean, we always live in the world of concepts.
Okay.
And to be able to perceive reality beyond those concepts is, I think, what enlightenment is all about, but I don't know. But what it does do is enlightenment is a way that lessens the sense of your ego, who you are. In other words, one of the things about Buddhism and about religion in general is the problems we find in life are almost always tied to our sense of who we are, the fact that we want things to be other than they are, and when they are not that way, you get upset. You know, sometimes people lose elections and they make up great big lies because they thought they won them, because they're upset at that, you know? So the whole question of Buddhism is dealing with who you are and who you think you are. And so initially, the time I was silent about the insights, they're so profound, they didn't know how to teach them. But after a couple of weeks, he came upon his way to teach the insights by starting with the four noble truths. And the first one is life is suffering. This sounds like a really damn depressing religion. There's several things here. First off, suffering is the English word they use to translate dukkha. Another way to translate it is that life is basically unfulfilled. There are basic things in life that you just cannot, you know, you're going to die. That's going to be a very unpleasant thing to happen most of the time for most of us. So the first noble truth is life is suffering. And the second noble truth is that suffering is caused by grasping. The idea that we want things to be the way we want it to be, and when they're not the way we want it to be, then we get very upset. And we can remove the suffering, eliminate the suffering by removing grasping. So this is the good news of Buddhism, right? The first noble truth is pretty much the bad news, but the good news is that most of that suffering is unnecessary because we have constructed that ourselves with our minds. And one can eliminate that grasping by following the Eightfold Path. Buddhism is famous for numbers.
And lists.
And lists, exactly.
Keep it organized.
So the big cause of suffering, the reason why we grasp at things is our sense of ego. We want things to happen as we want things to happen. We want to be happy. We want to have good relationships with other people. We want to have plenty of money. And when that doesn't happen, we get upset. Or we want to be elected president, and that doesn't happen. So we get very upset. So we have a very solid sense of who we are and what we want in life. And if things don't go that way, we expect we'll get unhappy. So we construct our ego with our minds. You know, from the time you were born until now, you have had experiences and such that construct the sense of who you are. And this you wants things to be a certain way. So the Eightfold Path is designed to erode away that sense of ego. So we can learn to see it as a construction of our mind. I mean, you're not going to get rid of your ego. Actually, it's pretty pathological to have no ego. People who end up with no ego usually end up in the mental wards. But so the point is to be able to see it as a construction of our mind and not to tie into all the demands that it thinks it wants. So here's the Eightfold Path. Right view, what does that mean? Well, essentially it means that you realize that your actions have consequences. Or, as the Buddha would have said, I did say, is that your actions follow your thoughts, like the wheels of the ox cart follow the cart, the ox. So if you are tied to your thoughts about what you want and what you need, those actions will follow that. So the right view is to essentially drop these ideas of who you are and what you are and see how they develop. Meditate. The right resolve is the idea of why are you doing this stuff? Okay, the Buddhist view of why you're doing this stuff. Well, the easiest way is, oh yeah, I want to get enlightened and all those cool things. But the real thing is you want to do it so you become a much nicer person that interacts in a much more generous way with other people. So the process of slowly getting rid of that ego makes you an easier person to deal with and makes you less of a burden on society. Right speech. What's right speech? Well, we know what wrong speech is, right? Lying about the fact that the election was stolen, that's wrong speech, right? Right speech is talking to people in a gentle way, not being angry, not lying, not gossiping. Right conduct, that's pretty straightforward. You treat others as you would like to be treated, and therefore you don't do things like stealing and other nasty things like that. Right livelihood depends upon how you live. Obviously, a wrong livelihood is someone who relies upon criminal activities. Someone who makes weapons. Buddhists, since Buddhism is largely vegetarian, a butcher would not have a right livelihood. Right effort. I was just thinking as I was coming up here that one of the things that distinguishes Buddhism from other religions is the intensity of the practices you have to put in. So what? The intensity of the practices. When I was on the 3-year retreat, so for 3 years, we meditated 11 hours a day or prayed, because it's hard to distinguish between some of the practices we did between meditation and prayer. When I wasn't on retreat, I'd be doing things, between 1 and 2 hours a day. So it requires a lot of effort because it requires essentially changing your view of the world. Right, mindfulness. Mindfulness is a practice where you're actually aware of what you're doing. When you sit in mindfulness, you're aware of how the mind is operating. The important thing on this is when you're mindful of what you're doing, mindful of how you're eating that beautiful piece of cantaloupe, you're not thinking about it, you're eating it and experiencing it directly. So mindfulness is direct experience of what's going on. It's not sitting there thinking about How nice does cantaloupe taste? They have had better though. And right meditation. It is the basic practice of Buddhism is meditation. Sitting on a meditation position and watching your mind as it spins around. And coming to get to know all the practices your mind does as it spins around. Now, over time, Buddhism evolved into many schools. The original Buddhism taught by the Buddha was what we would call Hinayana. Many of the people in the Theravada school consider the name Hinayana to be sort of an insult because it translates as a narrow way, yana being the path. But back 1,000 years ago or more, there are many schools of Hinayana Buddhism. So this Hinayana essentially identifies them. Now there's only one major school, and that's the Theravada. And this is the kind of Buddhism that you would find across Southern Asia, Sri Lanka, Sri Lanka. Mahayana Buddhism developed probably maybe as much as 500 years later, and is developed into three major schools. You all know Zen, Vajrayana. So Mahayana is the big way or the big path. Vajrayana is the diamond path, which is known as Tibetan Buddhism. And then there's Pure Land Buddhism. All of them consider themselves Mahayana. Zen, you all know Zen. Zen is prides itself as being, also a sect that is based upon understanding the teachings beyond the scriptures. In other words, getting direct experience of what the teachers are trying to say. And it's very tightly tied to extensive meditation, as is all of these. Vajrayana has a lot more influence of Hinduism. There's a lot of Hindu deities which they have just taken and accepted, but they don't consider them outside of you. They consider part of your psyche. So if you work on these deities, you're actually working on yourself. And Pure Land Buddhism, which is really common in Japan, it's the biggest Buddhism in Japan, has the idea that doing all this meditation stuff in this world is really hard. And they actually supplicate Amitabha Buddha, who lives in the Pure Land of Calgary, to be reborn there so they can do all the practice there after their death. So it's a very interesting thing in that it has an approach that's very similar to a lot of Christian approaches where you're supplicating some goddess for better birth. The Hinayana Buddhism is strongly focused on practice and virtually no metaphysics. The goal of Buddhist practitioners in this type of Buddhism was personal enlightenment. To give you some idea of the lack of metaphysics in this Buddhism is a classic story about the Buddha when asked if there was a God or something out there that determined how life was going. And he said, that is a question that's not worth answering. It's like if you were, shot by an arrow in your shoulder, before the doctor took it out, if you asked him, I want to know who shot this arrow, and I want to know who made the arrow shaft, and I want to know who put the point on the arrow shaft, you'd be suffering a lot more pain. All Buddhism was designed for is to reduce the pain of this life without having to worry about what the metaphysics are. Now, Mahayana Buddhism is a much heavier sense of metaphysics. It deals with all sorts of things about how we related to thought, where thought is dealing with it. All these, particularly in Tibetan Buddhism, all these deities they have obviously are related to metaphysical things. And the big difference is that the practitioner is also gaining enlightenment for the benefit of others. This is why Mahayana is called the big path and Hinayana is called the little path. So in Mahayana Buddhism, the person who attains enlightenment attains so he or she can help and teach others. And that kind of person called Bodhisattva. So that idea of essentially being on the path so you can help others on the path is not present nearly as much in the Hinayana. Now, these days, if you read a lot of stuff from the modern Theravada, a lot of this Hinayana stuff is filtered in there. So the distinction between the two is not so great. But that puts it forth because if you read about Buddhism, you're going to recognize those two terms, Hinayana, Mahayana, and Vajrayana. A really important thing about Buddhism is it's non-theistic. That means it accepts the presence of spiritual dimension, but it's not ascribed a personality to it. So that in Buddhism, the main, let's say, practice is to develop a realization of where your mind comes from and what your thinking is. It's got nothing to do with devotional practices. It's not a practice of belief, it's a practice of practice. So as I said, it's practice that involves attempts to awaken the practitioner to the reality. I don't know, I'm not enlightened, but I can say that what you do, what the practice does to you over time is it makes you realize that the ego is empty. It's empty thoughts. You develop this through, thinking about, how important I am, and I really want the stuff I want. And slowly, over many, many, many times sitting, you realize that you're not that important, and those things you want are just also empty. And then the key thing you learn, you might learn this pretty much the first time you meditate, is you sit, you meditate, and you watch your mind rise. And within about 10 seconds or maybe 20 seconds, suddenly you're thinking about something. And sometimes these thoughts are really, really good. Vivid. I mean, I can think of walking on a beach in Hawaii and feel the sand between my toes. and the sounds and the seagulls, and then you recognize you're thinking. It disappears. All these thoughts you've had about walking on the sand in Hawaii don't exist. They're just only in your mind. And the more you do this, the more you sit, the more you recognize your thoughts are empty and come back to that sit-in practice, the more you realize that the ego itself is also constructed. So that's how this practice works.
Okay, so I have a problem with this because,
Okay.
so when I meditate, I'm supposed to have a blank mind.
No, you're supposed to watch it.
Watch it. So how do I watch it if I can't think of anything?
No, it's fine. You sit here and thoughts come up, and you see these thoughts come up, and you see them go away. The problem most of the time with us when we think, and these thoughts come up, and oh, it's Hawaii. Oh, I love walking on that beach, and I love the sound of the sea. We get incorporated into that thought. Yeah, I read this really great comment by some sort of Tibetan master, and someone said about making the thoughts disappear. It says, we use that technique called the lead pipe meditation. I hit you on the head with a lead pipe, your thoughts are going to disappear. You're not going to be there, right? But what you want to do is you want to watch these thoughts, because these thoughts are telling you a lot of stuff about your habitual way of dealing with reality. And the more you come back to the reality that you're sitting on that cushion and the sand between your toes disappears, the more you realize that a lot of it, the constructs that bother us in our life are just made by our minds.
Okay, I'm not trying to be facetious or anything.
No, that's
Okay. But, I took a yoga class and she would have us lie down and I just fell asleep.
oh, you know what?
So-
I've been meditating for 30 years and I still fall asleep when I meditate. So, it's like, okay, I fell asleep. What else can I do about that? Yeah,
Can I add a little bit to try to answer Sally's question?
right, Sally?
Okay, because one of my teachers of contemplation says there's two ways to kind of think of this. One is the emptying of the mind, which is called apathy, so just let go of everything. And that's extremely difficult. Extremely difficult. The other is called cataphatic, where you use of your very focus. Like I could take one of the Cheetos and hold it in my hand. In order to refocus my mind. Some traditions use a sacred word, some might use an image, but it's like you notice ones that were right, you notice your mind going somewhere, at least you notice things are different. And then you were taught, don't beat up on yourself because your mind went to that, But then use something during that period to bring your mind back. So I don't know if there's things that work for you, Ron. But I'd be glad to tell them it's something that works. But don't be up on yourself. Drift away and use something to bring it back.
I mean, that's the secret, don't beat up on yourself,
So basically Buddhists are pacifists.
Well, that's the idea, right? I mean, the Japanese use Zen to make really brave fighters in the Second World War.
They made fighters in World War.
In the
Yeah.
Second World War. In other words, the idea would be pacifism, but just like in any other religion, there are examples where that has been used for warfare.
Okay.
Yeah, so, one of the statements I like is that you're perfect just the way you are. You can always get them.
I think Donald Trump is the Buddhist.
No.
He says he's perfect.
He's perfect.
Just don't ruin things that feel.
He's
Norman Vincent Peale, who's a power of positive thinking.
Oh,
No, there's really no COVID going around, but I don't want to detract from this conversation, but what you're dealing with, I think is very, very common. And different people are trying to practice meditation. Because our minds are busy all the time. Okay, let me watch it and then watch it go away. But
So, here's a very interesting quote from Rabbi Rami Shapiro. The story of the Buddha carries a challenge that the stories of the other founders of religions don't. There can be only one Abraham, there can be only one Moses, only one Jesus, only one Muhammad, and only one Krishna. Each of these individuals was called by God or was God. So there's no expectation that you can become another Moses or Muhammad or Jesus or Krishna. But you can become a Buddha, at least theoretically. In other words, we all have the ability to attain the realization that Buddha had if we do enough practice. And I think it's particularly interesting that this radical rabbi did a lot of Buddhist practice.
so the Dalai Lama, he's Buddhist, right?
He's Buddhist.
But he got to be the Dalai Lama through, was it hereditary?
That's a very interesting story. Think about 1,000 years ago or so. They developed in Tibet, the various schools of Buddhism, of which there's 4, developed these routines of the major teacher in that school taking rebirth. In other words, one of the things you do in Buddhist meditation for the really, really advanced people is you actually watch your mind when you fall asleep. The really, really intensely, people who are into this are aware the whole time they're asleep. And they're aware of when when the sleep is without thoughts and when the sleep is with thoughts. And it is said that when you're doing this, when you've gotten to the point where you know that your mind is sleeping, but you're aware of it, you're almost at the point of where humans would be after they die. Your mind is there, it's moving about, there's no body to it. And it is said that these various traditions then found a way to take rebirth with the same mind and a different body after having died. After the Dalai Lama, before this Dalai Lama died, he made predictions about where he'd be reborn, and other things about when the rebirth would be and stuff like that. So what they did is they sent a bunch of people out, obviously high monks, to areas where it had been predicted that he would be reborn, and they took along his meditation equipment. They have a bell and other things that they use during the meditation, and it was his personal equipment. And they went to these number of 2-year-olds out there and asked them which of these equipment was theirs. And when one of them identified it, completely, he became the Dalai Lama.
And then like a bell.
He defined his bell, the dorje, and the probably his mouth. And so it was not it's not inheritance. Okay, it came from a different family. Then, of course, he was taken into the monastery and educated in great depth. And we had a Tibetan Lama come out here, 1971. Trungpa Rinpoche. I got most of my teaching from his group. And Trungpa would tell stories how difficult it was to be a kid then. You know, because they, you know, you're taken away from your family, you have to learn, and you know, he just did not like it. He cried a lot. Another one of them, Trungpa Rinpoche said, well, they said that I'm supposed to be a reincarnated Lama. Well, I have to make a living somehow. This is not a bad way to make a living, so this is what I'll do. You know. So whether that's true or not, the key thing is once these people have gotten to the age of sometimes even just to 12 or 14, they have incredible wisdom, which suggests that they've had it born with them. Rather,
So they've had a past life.
they've had a past life. And sometimes they remember their past life. So anyhow, the idea of this is that you can be a Buddha. You are a Buddha, in fact. It's just that you don't realize it.
So can you be a Buddha and a Christian?
Absolutely.
Absolutely.
Absolutely. Let's see, there's a, I can't remember there's a Father Kennedy who was a Jesuit priest in New York. He was also a Zen Roshi.
It's what?
A Zen Roshi, a Zen teacher.
Oh, okay.
Yeah. And Thomas Keaton, who I'll talk about in a minute, I think, was well, his father, Thomas Keaton, I don't know what his monastic group was, but he had done a lot of Buddhist meditation as well. So, you know, the interesting thing we're getting to is that Buddhism seems so different from the other religions, but there appears to be no way to find a commonality between them. After all, it's a non-theistic religion. It doesn't involve belief of any sort. It just involves practice. And as the previous quote said, we can all be Buddhists. We can all do that practice to the point where we get the realization we have that potential in us. So this is actually important points I want to end up on, because this is the Wyoming Interfaith Network. How do we find commonality between this very, very strange Eastern religion and the religions that we're used to in the West? Close. Well, one of them is I found very interesting, and I don't know until we all realize this. That both Buddhism and Christianity contend there's a threefold nature to reality. You know, in Christianity, it's the Father, the Son, and the Holy Ghost. In Buddhism, it's Dharmakaya, Shimbogakaya, and Nirmanakaya. Kaya is sort of like kingdom or domain. Dharmakaya is a domain where essentially it's pure spiritual domain from which everything else manifests. Shimbogakaya is a domain that exists only in our mind, our dreams or thoughts. The teachings of various religions are there in the Dharmakaya. And the Nirmanakaya is our physical world. So you can say that Jesus was a manifestation of the divine in the Nirmanakaya. And the other commonality is in the similarity between contemplative prayer and mindfulness meditation. It's sort of a problem Let me go back. One of the big problems that threw me off when I started reading all this stuff and throws everybody off is that Christianity and Judaism have a completely different definition of meditation and contemplation than does Buddhism, Hinduism, and Sufism. In Christianity, contemplative practice is essentially practice where you're just not thinking, you just let your mind be there and see what arises. Meditation is a practice whereby you use thoughts to see how things arise. You know, this is like in the quote when someone says something to you and you go, oh, let me go home and meditate on that. Okay. In Buddhism and Hinduism and Sufism, it's completely backwards. Meditation is sitting there with complete empty mind, seeing what arises. And contemplation is thinking about things with words. So the thing that's, because of this, people have not really recognized that contemplative prayer is exactly the same as mindfulness meditation. In both practices, the aim is to watch your mind. And when a thought arises, you gently let it go. Don't let the thought carry you away to lands of great fantasy. So Thomas Keaton compares our consciousness to a flooded river that's clogged with floating debris. The debris represents the thoughts and emotions that continue to arise in our egos. Normally, we tend to identify ourselves with those thoughts and emotions that continually flow through our minds and are not aware that there must be something flowing along with that something. And as Keaton says, that something is the inner stream of consciousness, which is our participation in God's being. This is similar to in a way that's similar to contemplative prayer. Meditation does the same sort of thing. The goal of meditation is to realize that one's mind is the Dharmakaya, that spiritual dimension from which everything arises. I can't see that there's any difference between that and the definition I gave before by Thomas Keaton about being aware of your mind in essentially God's creation. Okay. So this is the root of interfaith dialogue. Each faith may be built around different symbols, doctrines, rituals. Each faith also has contemplative practices that give direct experience of their body. Contemplatives from all religions have no problem finding commonalities between their religions based upon their common religious experiences. And I like to use this as a way to express it. So there's an old Zen saying that when the wise man points at the moon, all the fool sees is the finger. Okay, the moon is that spiritual dimension out there that is inexpressible by any words. And the fingers are all the religions that we deal with. So when people talk about the differences between the various religions, they concentrate on the fingers. You know, there may be black fingers in there, there might be white fingers in there, there might be people with all sorts of different complexions. The fingernails might be painted, but they're all pointing to the same moon. And that's the significance of interfaith interaction. I think that's my last piece. Yes, it is. Okay.
Can I ask you if you're enlightened?
I absolutely.
He
not.
already said this one.
Oh, okay.
He gave us that.
No, you know, the more sitting I do, the more I realize, oh man, I gotta wait. But, you know, the practice does make you a gentler person. I mean, I grew up in New Jersey, okay, and I had a personality like the people in The Sopranos. I like to say it took 25 years of meditation to become even a gentle person. So No, I'm not enlightened. I'm working on it.
I will speak for Rondo because when he comes on our calls for our meetings, I would like it when you come on a couple minutes early because you're just such a soothing presence. You really, you may not be enlightened, but you're a very peaceful person.
Well, thank you. Well, you know, as I said, when I went on the 3-year retreat, they said, you know, don't expect to be enlightened, but expect the effects of 3 years of meditation like that to manifest in ways that you'll never understand. Any further questions?
Why did you become a Buddhist?
Well, I grew up, my father was an avid atheist. I grew up as an atheist. And in high school, I had a really stunning religious experience. I was out walking in the woods in the snow, it was nighttime. And I was thinking, every snowflake is different. So I'm surrounded by an infinity of snowflakes that are coming down. That sense of infinity suddenly turned everything inside out. I mean, I was suddenly immersed in this great white light, which, as an atheist, was totally beyond concept. You know, I mean, I couldn't talk about it. I didn't know what it meant. But what it did tell me was that there is a lot more to physical reality than what we see. And so, you know, I went to college and I was studying geology, and then I spent all my spare time reading essentially the Eastern spiritual books that were coming around at that time. And after I got to Wyoming and I essentially got tenure, almost within weeks after getting tenure, I signed up for a program in Buddhist meditation. And as soon as I took it, I said, this is my spiritual path.
Ron, if you wouldn't mind speaking up a little bit, some of
Oh,
our
I'm
people
sorry.
are having trouble hearing.
Usually, this is the last thing people tell me.
So yeah, tell us at the end.
I know, right? Sorry about that, yeah. I have a student, an adult student who identifies himself as Swedish Lutheran Buddhist. And I've heard it said that Buddhism is easy or can be combined with other religious practices without doing damage to either one. Is
That's
that
right. Well, that was the point when I'm talking about the contemplative prayer.
Mhm.
It's no different than mindfulness meditation. Right? Our problem in general with understanding religion is that most of the experience of religion is ineffable.
is ineffable.
Ineffable. You can't put it into words.
Okay.
So what they try to do is they try to use symbols in place of the words. And so almost all these religions, all these figures pointing at the moon are complex symbols and mythologies trying to explain this spiritual experience. And as long as you realize these things are analogies or myths or symbols, everything's fine. Once you take them as being solid reality, then you get in trouble.
Okay, I think it's really interesting that when you were experiencing the snow and you said you had that, I think, epiphany, why you didn't have an epiphany and realize that God is real?
Well, I had been well trained as an atheist.
Oh,
Okay. I mean, my father regularly talked about all the horrors of religion. And, you know, so the interesting thing was because I was so strongly atheistic, the only religion that made me move was a non-theistic one. Where you didn't have to worry about belief, You just worry about practice. And the interesting thing is, when I came out of retreat in 2017, I was still very Buddhist centric. And then I came and so I knew Sal for a long time. I met with Sal and she said, Ron, you have to read these books. And I slowly went from being Buddhist oriented to being, what should we say, perennial oriented, the perennial philosophy that everything is pointing to the same ineffable meaning.
So, do you appreciate your father's influence
Well,
as first the atheist, or do you kind of wish you would have had a different?
it's interesting because that's the path I had to follow, right? In the book, I write the story about how my father once lit up a piece of magnesium metal on the street. I don't know if you know about magnesium flare, but magnesium metal, it was nighttime, lit up the whole street. It was really, really spectacular. My father gave me all these really cool scientific experiments that made me be very interested in science. Okay, so there was an influence there. What he didn't expect is that I had influences someplace else that make me more spiritual. No, I think when it comes to questions like that, that's my path. That's how I got here. So.
Yeah, I just had a couple of things. One is a delight to know you. But I want this whole group to know what it means to me for you to follow the path of kindness. Because you have no idea all the kinds of things that Ron does just to be kind. And you can tell people what's happening. Remember this week as you're a refuge for someone, but I know you have adopted a dog, you work for hospice. And whenever I come to see you to talk about our work together, and I'm late, you say, what's late? Or something like that. It's like, but for Ron, I see him as someone that changed as a hard scientist, because he's lucky as a geologist, rocks are involved. And I mean, they don't move, they don't have migration.
Rocks are hard.
But you work for something really solid to that practice, that the dangerous practice, ineffable, unspeakable, but has an authority of its own. And it's also transient, that things come and go. So I want to mention a book, and if you want to invite people to our Zen discussion, this Monday you can. But one of the members of our group suggested a Zen book called When All You Have to Hold On To Is Letting Go. It's a great book. It's a really fun thing. You're a good teacher. Thank you.
Thank you. My answer to that is, do my best. Okay, well, we did pretty well.
Wow.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. Yeah. Within the hour structure. Anything else you'd like us to know, or any questions from Zoom land or from our Laramie audience?
Did you bring your book?
I thought everybody here had one.
Yes. Yep. That one there. Yep.
Can you tell us a little about writing, because you wrote this a while ago, didn't you?
Well, no, I wrote, when you're on retreat, you're not supposed to be thinking about things outside of retreat. And I remember, certainly, or early 2000s, there's this big push of literature by the neo-atheists, which are really, they're very, very emphatic about there is no religion, there is no God, all this stuff is a bunch of crap. And you have to, look at science for answers. And I think it was in the second year retreat, I started coming up with thoughts, sometimes when I couldn't sleep, on how to answer the neo-atheists. And So so initially, for the first 2 years, when I was on retreats, year 2 and year 3, this was all forming in my mind. And I thought I had it pretty well figured out until I got back and tried to put it on paper. So it took me from 2017 till 2020 to get this thing written. And Sal was a big help. Katie Ballard from the Unitarian Church was a big help. Sort of, and Rami Shapiro. He's a big name in progressive theology. And I sent him an email once, I tried to talk to him, asking him about Jewish mysticism, and I was totally wrong. His answer was a little sharp, so you were to read this and this and this. So I read that and that and that, and I wrote some more stuff. And I answered him, and he answered back. I mean, a lot of people I wrote to, never answered back. And he answered back and gave me lots of help, and then he actually gave me endorsement in the book. So, but yeah, so it wasn't me alone who wrote the book. The book got written on its own, but I had lots of help.
So during your retreat, you were allowed to think of these material things like writing a book or?
Well, it wasn't, you can't keep people from thinking, right? It was frowned upon, but the interesting thing is that it would take place at night in a series of dreams and stuff like that. I had absolutely no control of those things.
Okay.
I mean, if I was a really good Buddhist, I would have control of my dreams, but I couldn't do that. So that slowly formed, in my mind. And so, yeah, I like to say that I didn't write that book. It got written through me.
So how does a Buddhist deal with the questions, hard questions like, when bad things happen to people, or the next life, or do you believe that there is another life, or?
I tend to think that there's solid enough evidence among the great practitioners of Buddhism that there is another life. Well, first off, let's put it this way. Your mind is not your body. Your body is going to die. Your mind is not going to die. So what happens to your mind is, the big mystery. And it's the big mystery that fits all religions. And I would say that most of the religions make the point that what happens to you after you die is really dependent upon how you behave in this life. You treat people well now, and things in the afterlife is not going to be quite so bad. Buddhism would say exactly that. That mindset, that if you have a settled, happy mind, then what's coming up in your mind, I mean, what happens after you die is stuff coming up in your mind that's been buried there for your whole life. And if you've got a happy life and a reasonably satisfied life, then what comes up is not terribly disturbing. If you've had a not happy life, if you have to, like poor Mr. Trump, if stuff comes up, it's going to be really nasty. You're going to be scrambling like crazy to get away from it. Uh-oh.
That's my alarm saying it's 2:00. That doesn't mean we have to quit talking.
So yes, Buddhism does. The key thing in Buddhism is that the mind doesn't die, and I think that's the key thing in most religions. And what happens afterwards is a question that we don't know directly, right? I mean, I'll know directly after I die, but I can't come back and tell you and say, "Oh man, that was really cool." That won't happen. So Yeah.
I also want to applaud you for your persistence in finding the common denominator. You don't let other labels. And then if you look at what you're saying and what Dr. Dixon was saying, it's like, okay, a label is not going to get in the way, and you're finding that bond that you have with other people. And even with your dog. But I think that's part of your practice, but you do it well. You know? So just one more thing, I'll try to be good, but I have information from you.
Okay.
But basically, I came to contemplation because of being a Quaker when I was in graduate school at Princeton. We had great Quaker meetings, and we sit in silence for an hour, you know, and so, okay, that helped me away from my feelings where I was doing academic work. So I moved here after 7 permutations of self. And somebody named Bruce Kinsey asked me, Ken, would you be able to teach Quaker? Well, yeah, I could do that. This is 1990, because I remember the Quakers. And I just want to say one thing that I find really similar when I hear you and when I watch Quaker practice, and that is one of the things that Quakers are doing in the silence. And you'll say, they lift you to the light. And one of their words for God is light. You know, so I have a good friend who has many imageries, and I'm just like, I lift you to the light. You know? But I don't know if you find other, you know, other ways of describing the movement, your practice from other religions, because they're there. You know, it's just dancing. But anyway.
You know, they're all there. I mean, and the key thing I found was the similarity between contemplative prayer and mindfulness meditation. It's so close. But another thing I found as I was writing the book was scripture.
Mhm.
You know, the
Lectio Divina.
Lectio Divina is it's in all of them. I mean, in Judaism, you read the Torah, for example, and you can read all sorts of different levels. And the deeper you get, the more spiritual it becomes. The same thing is true in Sufism when they talk about the Quran. The more, you know, you can read it deeper and deeper and deeper. So there's another practice which is the same in all these religions as that. I mean, you know, the similarities are much, much bigger than the differences. The differences are only in the explanation people have to, you know, what the experience is all about.
The greeting Namaste, I've been told, comes from the Buddhist is that accurate? And
I think it's mostly Hindu,
okay,
but you know, Buddhism is, you know, associated to Hindu as Christianity is to Judaism.
okay,
In fact, you see, Tibetan Buddhism, so Buddhism formed, you know, the Hinayana type stuff in the 500s or so BC as a very special practice. And then by about 1000 so AD, or maybe 700 AD, it went back into India and incorporated all these things from Hinduism, which became Tibetan Buddhism.
okay.
I mean, the difference between Tibetan Buddhism and Hinduism is that all these deities that I practice with are not outside, they're in here. You know, they're not outside gods, they're things within my mind. And so if you visualize them and you get to know them, you can actually use them to change various aspects of your personality. So, namaste fine in Buddhism. But I also, most of the time when I'm using in when I'm doing yoga.
Yeah. Um, Now, mentioning yoga, there is pushback and has been for several years amongst evangelical fundamentalists against yoga. It's that you can't be Christian and do yoga. Whereas I come from the mindset like it's like the difference between contemplative prayer and mindfulness meditation. It's the same thing.
It's a practice. Yeah. It's
Yeah.
opening you up to what is outside this physical world, which Christians would call God. Yeah, I like this quote. I think it was from, who was it? I don't know, it's from one of the fundamentalists. Minister was very much against contemplative practice. He says, who are you going to believe? Are you going to believe what comes up in your mind, or are you going to believe what's in the Bible? Well, I believe what comes up in my mind. Okay. But then to him, I'm going straight to hell. I'm going to go straight to hell anyhow. Or as one person said, I'm going to go to a very warm place.
People that I've talked to that have trouble being accepted as a contemplative or as a Buddhist or practicing meditation for something as simple as, Tai Chi is the suspicion. So this one deep friend of mine was told by a priest, don't practice contemplation because the devil will come into your thoughts.
Exactly.
If your thoughts are open, guess what can come in?
So that means let's be as closed-minded as we possibly can, and that way the devil won't get to us.
So if you contemplate things, it opens it up to the devil coming in,
That's a philosophy.
That's-
That's the fear. Yeah.
Yeah.
so you're just not supposed to think,
That's the whole thing, isn't it?
no question.
A lot of these churches, you believe what they tell you to believe, and if you don't do it, you are sinning. You're going to go to a very warm place.
It's difficult having come out of that mindset that you're taught that you need to protect, you guard your heart is a phrase, protect your mind against false or evil influences, that kind of thing.
Going back to this morning, that's where racism is.
Yeah.
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 And that's, now you can say, well, that's very reasonable. If you could take your mind from doing nasty things,
It sounds
it
reasonable.
sounds reasonable.
Yeah.
But if you could take your mind from questioning the whole dogma of various religions, then that's not reason, right? Because the whole idea is questioning, getting the experience yourself.
And coming out of that and some conversations with people with that mindset, my experience has been that it is fear-based.
Oh,
That
absolutely.
I cannot allow anything new in just in case it's evil. So if it's not something my parents taught me or my pastor when I was 10 years old taught me, I can't trust it. My experience of the world has been completely opposite. That there are many wonderful things in this world that my parents didn't teach me, and my pastor when I was 10 years old didn't teach me. And some of them come from my Buddhist friends or my LDS friend or or my Native American friend. And they actually, in my experience, make my faith in Christ fuller, healthier.
Well, isn't
Yeah.
that the, essentially the, say, the basis of Wyoming Interfaith Network? The
Yeah,
more you interact with other faiths, the stronger you shall become.
that's true. I guess to some extent, I was always the oddball out, the odd duck, and that I didn't mind asking questions. I didn't mind if people asked me questions. If that question was allowed me to become wiser or kinder, then it served a purpose, whether it hurt or not. That was okay. And you know, even when I was a kid, you know, the preacher would say such and such from the pulpit, and I'd go, wait a second. One or two things was going on in my head. Number one, there's another part of the Bible that says something different. Let me go back to that. Or number two, that's not the reality going on around us. And being able to reconcile that, or if there was no reconciliation, choosing a right path forward has been part of my personal spirit. Yeah, y'all were asking about spiritual journeys. That's been part of mine. Dr. Frost, Ron, thank you so much. We'll say goodbye to our Zoomlanders. For Anne-Marie, do you have anything for us?
I don't think so. Thank you for joining, and we'll get these posted shortly to the website.
All right. Yeah, so for those of you that want to review some of our video recordings, they'll be posted on the website. And we'll say goodbye to Zoomland. Those of us in Laramie, stick around for a few minutes. My core group will be heading out to Cheyenne here about 2:30-ish. Thank you, Ron.
Thank you.